They tied her to a wooden stake in the middle of the marketplace. She was 19. Around her stood priests, soldiers, judges, and a crowd that had come to watch a girl die. Some called her a witch, some called her a liar, some called her dangerous. But only a few years earlier, this same girl had walked into a hopeless war, put on armor, carried a white banner, and changed the fate of France. She had no army, no noble blood, no education in politics, no training as a commander. She was a peasant girl from a village most powerful men had never heard of. And yet kings listened to her, soldiers followed her, enemies feared her. Because Joan of Arc claimed something almost impossible. She said voices from heaven had spoken to her, and they told her to save France. But the real question is not whether Joan heard angels. The real question is why an entire kingdom was desperate enough to believe her. France, in the early 1400s, was not the proud kingdom we imagine today. It was broken. For decades, England and France had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict that seemed to have no end. Cities changed hands, fields burned, villages were emptied. Armies marched over the same lands again and again, leaving hunger, fear, and bodies behind them. And France was losing, badly. The English controlled large parts of the country. The Duke of Burgundy, a powerful French noble, had sided with England. Even Paris was no longer safely in French hands. The French king, Charles VI, had suffered from severe mental illness, and the kingdom around him had fractured into rival factions. Then came the deepest wound. A treaty declared that the French crown would pass not to the French prince, but to the English king. Imagine that. France was being erased from inside its own royal line. The rightful French heir, Charles, was pushed aside and mocked as weak, uncertain, and possibly illegitimate. He was not even crowned. He was only the Dauphin, the heir who might never become king. France did not just need soldiers. It needed belief. It needed a sign. It needed something so strange that people might dare to hope again. And that sign came from a village girl. Joan was born around 1412 in Domremy, a small village in eastern France. Her world was not palaces and strategy maps. It was fields, church bells, farm animals, winter mud, prayer. She grew up in a deeply religious household, in a village that knew the war not as politics, but as suffering. Soldiers could appear without warning. Homes could be destroyed. Families could be displaced. To nobles, war was territory. To peasants, war was terror arriving on horseback. Joan was not raised to command men. She was raised to work, pray, obey, and survive. But when she was about 13, something happened that changed everything. She began hearing voices. She said they belonged to saints, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. At first, the voices told her to be good, to pray, to remain faithful. But over time, their message became more terrifying. They told her she had a mission. She was to go to the Dauphin. She was to help lift the siege of Orléans. She was to lead him to Reims and see him crowned King of France. For anyone else, this would have sounded insane. For Joan, it became destiny. Think about what Joan was claiming. A teenage peasant girl was saying she had been chosen by God to decide the future of a kingdom. She had no army, no money, no powerful family, no reason for anyone important to listen. And yet, she kept insisting. She first went to local officials and asked to be sent to the Dauphin. They dismissed her. Of course they did. A village girl talking about heavenly voices and military rescue sounded ridiculous. But Joan did not disappear. She returned, again and again.
Her certainty was almost frightening. She did not speak like someone asking permission. She spoke like someone delivering a message. Eventually, whether out of curiosity, desperation, or fear of ignoring a possible sign from God, she was allowed to travel to meet Charles. She cut her hair short, put on men's clothing for safety during the journey, and crossed dangerous territory to reach the French court. When she arrived, the court did not know what to do with her. Some saw a holy messenger, some saw a fraud, some saw a political opportunity, some saw madness. But Joan stood before the Dauphin and told him he would be crowned king. Not maybe, not if politics allowed it. He would be crowned, and she would help make it happen. Before Charles trusted Joan, she had to be examined. The church questioned her. The court watched her. People wanted to know, was she sent by God, or was she dangerous? In the medieval world, this mattered deeply. A person claiming divine voices could be a saint, or a heretic, or worse.
Joan was questioned about her faith, her visions, her behavior, and her mission. She answered with surprising clarity. She was not a trained theologian, but she had something more powerful than polished speech: conviction. She seemed utterly certain that heaven had chosen her, and France was desperate enough to let certainty become strategy. So Charles made a decision that could have ruined him. He allowed Joan to go to Orléans. Orléans was critical. The English had surrounded it. If the city fell, the road deeper into France would open. The French cause might collapse completely. And now, into one of the most important military crises of the war, came a girl in armor, carrying a white banner. Not a sword dripping with conquest, a banner. That detail matters. Joan did not become powerful because she looked like every other warrior. She became powerful because she looked like something different. A symbol, a warning, a miracle with a heartbeat. When Joan arrived at Orléans in 1429, the city was exhausted. The defenders had been trapped for months. Hope was thin, fear was everywhere. Then Joan entered, and something changed. Not because she suddenly became a master strategist overnight, not because she personally defeated an army alone, but because belief is a weapon. And Joan carried belief like fire. Soldiers who had been tired began to move with new energy. Commanders who had hesitated found momentum. Civilians who had feared abandonment saw a sign that heaven had not forgotten them. Joan rode near the fighting. She urged attacks. She carried her banner through danger. She was wounded, but returned. That mattered. A noble commander could order men forward. Joan made men feel watched by God. Within days, the siege was broken. Orléans was saved, and France had its miracle. The English, who had mocked her, now had to explain her. The French, who had doubted her, now began to believe. Joan had done the impossible. But victory is dangerous, because once people believe you are chosen, they expect heaven to keep proving it. Joan's mission was not only to save Orléans. She had said Charles must be crowned at Reims. That was not symbolic decoration, it was everything. French kings were traditionally crowned in Reims Cathedral. If Charles was crowned there, he would no longer be merely a desperate claimant hiding behind uncertainty. He would be King Charles VII of France. Legitimacy would return. The kingdom would have a center again. So Joan pushed. She wanted movement, boldness, faith. And against all odds, the French army advanced. Town after town opened the way. The road that had seemed impossible became real. Then, in July 1429, Charles entered Reims. Inside the cathedral, with sacred oil, ancient ritual, nobles, clergy, and soldiers watching, the Dauphin became king. Joan stood nearby with her banner. The village girl had done what she said she would do. She had led a broken prince to his crown. This should have been her ending, a perfect legend. The girl sent by heaven, the king crowned, France reborn. But history is crueler than legend, because after the miracle, politics returned. Joan wanted to keep fighting. She wanted to push the English harder. She wanted Paris. She wanted France free. But Charles was cautious. The court was cautious. Nobles had their own interests. Diplomacy, delay, rivalry, and fear began to slow the momentum. Joan's power had come from certainty, but royal courts do not run on certainty. They run on calculation. And Joan was becoming difficult. She was too famous, too uncontrollable, too convinced of her mission. The same qualities that made her useful now made her dangerous. In 1430, during fighting near Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces. This was the beginning of the end. The girl who had lifted a kingdom was now a prisoner, and the king she helped crown did not rescue her. That is one of the darkest parts of her story. Charles owed Joan everything, but politics moved colder than gratitude. She was sold to the English, and the English knew exactly what they had. They had not only captured a girl, they had captured the symbol of French hope. So they decided to destroy the symbol. Joan was put on trial in Rouen. But this was never just a trial. It was a political execution dressed in religious language. The English needed Joan discredited. If she was truly sent by God, then what did that say about England? If her victories were holy, then English defeat carried shame. So they had to prove she was not a messenger of heaven. They had to make her a liar, a heretic, a witch, a fraud. She was questioned for weeks by educated men who tried to trap her with theology, law, and language. She was alone, a teenage girl facing trained clerics and hostile judges. But again and again, Joan answered with astonishing strength. When they asked whether she was in God's grace, it was a trap. If she said yes, she could be accused of arrogance. If she said no, she admitted guilt. Her answer cut through them. If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there. That was Joan. Uneducated maybe, but not simple. Afraid, yes, but not broken. Still, the trial was designed to end one way, and it did. She was condemned. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was taken to the marketplace in Rouen. She was 19 years old. The crowd gathered, the stake waited. A cross was brought for her to see. The girl who had once ridden with armies now stood alone before death. And in her final moments, she called on Jesus. There is no need to make this scene bigger than it already is. It is already unbearable. A young woman who had changed the course of a kingdom was killed by the world she had entered. The English wanted her name ruined. They wanted her memory buried. They wanted history to remember her as a criminal. But history refused. Years later, Joan's trial was re-examined. The verdict was overturned. She was declared innocent. Centuries after her death, she was canonized as a saint. But even without that, her story had already escaped the men who tried to control it. Because Joan of Arc became something rare in history. She became both human and legend, a girl and a symbol, a believer and a soldier, a peasant and a national icon. Was she truly hearing saints? Was she driven by faith so intense that it became unstoppable? Was she a genius of morale, timing, and courage? The answer depends on what you believe, but the result is not in doubt. Before Joan, France was collapsing. After Joan, France had a king, a victory, and a reason to keep fighting. She did not end the war alone, but she changed its direction. She gave a dying kingdom the one thing armies cannot manufacture: hope. And maybe that is why her story still feels alive. Because Joan reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, generals, and empires. Sometimes history turns because one person hears a voice no one else can hear, and has the courage, or the madness, to follow it into fire.